You are lying awake in a room where the only moving thing is the shadow of a dying candle, thrown against walls of cold, weeping stone. Outside, the night does not carry the familiar, comforting sounds of a city settling into sleep. Instead, it holds a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional, distant sound of a cart's iron-rimmed wheels scraping against wet basalt. It is the sound of the dead being moved under the cover of darkness, so the living do not have to watch the true scale of their undoing. You can smell the sharp, medicinal sting of burning pine knots and dried lavender, lit at every corner in a desperate, futile attempt to smoke out the invisible rot that has settled into the very lungs of the empire. This is Rome, in the late 2nd century, but it is not the Rome of golden triumphs or marble arrogance. The air is thick with the Antonine Plague, a silent, faceless invader that crawled out of the Eastern campaigns, hitched a ride on the breath of returning legions, and swallowed the known world whole. A few feet away, sitting at a simple wooden table that groans under the weight of state papers and official casualty rolls, is a man who looks far older than his 50 years. His beard is shot through with silver. His eyes are heavy with a fatigue that sleep can no longer remedy, and his woolen cloak is wrapped tightly around shoulders that bear the literal and spiritual weight of millions of souls. This is Marcus Aurelius. He is the master of the Mediterranean, the commander of 30 legions, and the absolute ruler of the greatest empire the earth has ever seen. Yet, as he dips his reed pen into dark ink, he does not look like a god. He looks like a tired father, sitting in a house where everyone is dying. He is not writing a decree to the Senate, nor is he drafting a military strategy to push back the Germanic tribes massing at the freezing borders of the Danube. He is writing to himself. He is writing to keep his own mind from fracturing under the pressure of a reality that seems entirely designed to break him. Every stroke of his pen on the rough papyrus is a quiet act of defiance against despair, a slow, deliberate breathing exercise meant to steady a heart that is constantly being pulled toward the abyss of hopelessness. You watch as he pauses, his hand hovering over the page. He looks at his own fingers, pale and trembling slightly from the damp chill of the Roman night. He is thinking about how easily those fingers could fail him. He has watched his friends, his generals, his advisors, and his own children succumb to the pustules and the burning fevers of this pestilence. He knows that the imperial purple robe he wears is no shield against the microscopic fire that turns a strong man into a corpse within days. The silence in the room is vast, almost oceanic, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of the blood rushing through your own veins. It is a terrifying realization for a man who has been told his entire life that he is part of a divine lineage, that Rome is eternal, and that the gods have a plan for his people. Right now, in the dead of night, with the empire's economy collapsing, its armies decimated, and the streets of the capital turning into open pits for the dead, those grand myths feel incredibly thin. They feel like ghost stories, told to children to keep them from fearing the dark. But Marcus does not have the luxury of fear. If he breaks, the empire shatters with him. The people do not need a warrior right now. They do not even need a politician. They need a pillar, something that does not sway when the ground beneath it turns to mud. And so, he forces his eyes back to the page. He reminds himself of a fundamental truth that he will return to again and again throughout these long, dark years. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. It is a beautiful, fragile thought to hold on to when the world outside your window is actively burning. It is the core of what the world will later call Stoicism. But to Marcus, it isn't a philosophy to be discussed over wine in a comfortable academy. It is a survival tourniquet. It is the only thing keeping the blood from leaking out of his soul. The candle flickers, casting a long, dancing shadow across the map of the empire, laid out on the corner of the table. That map represents the entirely human illusion of control. For centuries, Rome believed that if it just built enough roads, conquered enough territory, and sacrificed enough animals at the altars, it could tame the wild chaos of existence. The Romans thought they had fenced in the world. They believed they had created a space of order and law amidst a sea of barbarian darkness. Yet, the plague has revealed the terrifying truth that nature does not care about Roman law. It does not recognize the authority of the emperor. It bypasses the border forts, ignores the customs officials at the ports, and walks straight into the bedrooms of patricians and plebeians alike. It has brought the machinery of the state to a grinding halt. The markets are empty, the temples are avoided because crowds bring death, and the taxes that fund the legions have slowed to a trickle. Marcus looks down at the casualty lists from the city of Rome itself. Thousands are dying every single day. The corpses are being piled onto carts, stacked like firewood, and taken to the Tiber or buried in mass trenches outside the walls. The administrative structure he spent his life perfecting is working at a fraction of its capacity because the clerks, the judges, and the tax collectors are all dying too. You can feel the suffocating claustrophobia of his position. He is trapped at the top of a pyramid that is crumbling from the base upward. Anyone else might have surrendered to anger, blamed the gods, or hidden away in a seaside villa in Campania, surrounded by physicians and guards, letting the world burn from a safe distance. But Marcus stayed. He chose to remain in the thick of the smoke, to look the monster in the eye, and to endure the agonizingly slow passage of the hours because he believed that an emperor is not a master, but the first servant of the common good. As the night deepens, the cold becomes more aggressive, seeping through the heavy wool of his cloak and settling deep into his joints. Marcus suffers from a chronic chest ailment, a persistent, coughing vulnerability that makes the thick, smoky air of the plague-ridden room dangerous for him. Every breath he takes feels like a negotiation with fate. He uses a small dose of theriac, a mixture of opium and various herbs prescribed by his personal physician, Galen, to dull the sharp physical pain in his stomach and chest. But he refuses to take enough to dull his mind. He needs to stay awake. He needs to remain conscious of his duties, even when consciousness itself is a form of torture. He writes another line: wipe out your impressions. Specify to yourself what is happening. See it for what it truly is. This is his mental armor. When he looks at the plague, he forces himself not to see it as a cosmic curse or the anger of the gods, but as a natural process, a breaking down of elements, a terrible but inevitable part of a larger universe that is constantly changing, dying, and regenerating. If he allows himself to view it as an emotional tragedy, he will be paralyzed by grief. If he views it as a biological reality, he can find the clarity to act. It is a strange, comforting paradox. By stripping the world of its emotional drama, he finds the peace necessary to care for the people suffering within it. He looks at the city not with despair, but with a profound, clear-eyed compassion. They are his flock, and they are terrified. They are buying lucky amulets, sacrificing their last goats to foreign deities, and listening to street corner prophets who promise salvation for a price. They are acting out of fear, and Marcus understands fear. He does not judge them for their panic. He only wishes he could give them a fraction of the stillness he is trying so hard to cultivate within his own chest. The world outside is so quiet now that you can hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of his reed pen. It is a slow, methodical sound that acts as a heartbeat for the room. It says, "I am still here. I am still thinking. I am still standing guard." He reflects on the nature of fame, of empire, and of all the great names that came before him. Where are they now? Augustus, Tiberius, Hadrian. Men who held the same absolute power he holds now. Men who filled the world with their statues and their monuments. They are nothing but stories now. Names that are slowly fading from the memories of living men. Some are already entirely forgotten. Marcus realizes that his own name will eventually meet the same fate. The plague will pass, the empire will eventually fall, the statues will be broken and buried under the dirt of future centuries, and no one will remember the man who sat in this room, shivering by a dying candle, trying to save a world that did not want to be saved. And instead of making him depressed, this thought brings him an immense, liberating relief. If the future does not matter, if fame is an illusion, then the only thing that matters is this exact moment. The only thing that has value is what he does right now, in the present, with the choices available to him. Is he being just? Is he being brave? Is he doing his duty as a human being? If the answer is yes, then nothing else can harm him. Not the plague, not the betrayals of his closest allies, not the terrifying silence of the gods.
He looks out the small window toward the eastern horizon. The sky is not yet bright, but the deep black of midnight is beginning to soften into a bruised, smoky purple. Another day is coming, another day of checking casualty figures, of listening to the weeping of citizens, of trying to keep an economy from collapsing, of writing letters to generals on distant frontiers who are buried under snow and surrounded by enemies. He knows he cannot stop the plague. He cannot bring back the dead. He cannot cure the sickness that has infected the body of his empire, but he can control how he responds to it. He can choose not to complain. He can choose not to yield to bitterness. He can choose to love the flawed, terrified, broken human beings who depend on him, even when they turn on him out of panic. He finishes the page, leaves the ink to dry in the cool morning air, and gently closes the papyrus journal. He sits back in his chair, closes his eyes for just a moment, and lets the profound weight of his existence wash over him without fighting it. He is Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, but in this quiet hour before dawn, he is simply a man who has looked into the dark, recognized its power, and decided to light a candle anyway. You are standing in the sun-drenched courtyard of a patrician villa on the Celian hill, far removed from the damp, suffocating panic of the Danube frontier. The air here is thin, sweet, and heavy with the scent of blooming orange blossoms and wet earth after a sudden summer shower. It is the Rome of decades past, a world that feels entirely insulated from the cold realities of the northern borders and the invisible terror of pestilence. Here, the marble is clean, unspotted by the grime of a collapsing society, and the fountains splash rhythmically against white stone, creating an artificial heartbeat of absolute peace. In the center of this courtyard stands a young boy, barely a man, dressed not in the soft, luxurious silks of his social class, but in the coarse, heavy gray wool of a traditional philosopher. He is sleeping on the hard stone floor, refusing the feather mattress in his bedchamber, his body wrapped in nothing but a rough cloak. This is the young Marcus, a child who has already looked at the glittering surface of the Roman aristocracy and chosen to seek something solid beneath the gold leaf. To understand the endurance of the man in the war tent, you must watch the boy in this garden. Marcus was not born to the purple robe. He was not the biological heir to an emperor. His family was noble, wealthy, and respected, tracing their roots back to the ancient kings of Numa, but they were not the rulers of the earth. His childhood was not shaped by the grand architectural ambitions of the state, but by the quiet, crushing weight of early absence. His father, Annius Verus, vanished from his life when Marcus was a mere toddler, leaving behind a silence that the boy would spend his entire youth trying to decipher. In a Roman patrician family, a father was not just a protector. He was the source of identity, the legal anchor, the person who introduced you to the ancestors whose wax masks stared down from the walls of the atrium. Without him, Marcus grew up under the heavy, watchful eyes of his mother, Domitia Lucilla, and his grandfather. You watch him as he sits at his mother's feet. Domitia Lucilla was a woman of immense wealth, owning vast clay fields and brickworks that stamped their mark onto the very infrastructure of Rome's building boom. Yet, her influence on Marcus was not one of commercial greed or political ambition. She was a woman of deep, reflective piety, a quiet intellectual who preferred the company of books and philosophers to the poisonous gossip of the imperial court. From her, Marcus learned what he would later describe as religiosity, generosity, and the habit of abstaining not only from doing wrong, but even from thinking it. In her apartments, the noise of Rome's crowded streets was reduced to a distant hum. She taught him to observe the world without greed, to look at the massive wealth surrounding them as a temporary loan from the universe rather than a permanent possession. It was a strange, monastic upbringing for a boy who would one day command the wealth of the Mediterranean. While other young nobles were learning to race chariots, gamble on gladiatorial matches, and master the cruel, competitive arts of political rhetoric, Marcus was being trained to notice the smallness of human vanity. His grandfather, a man who had held the highest offices of the state, provided the masculine structure that his father could not. He taught the boy value in consistency, showing him that a man's life is measured by the steady, unyielding performance of his duty, day after day, without the need for public applause. But it was the arrival of his tutors that crystallized the fluid, searching mind of the young Marcus into something hard, resilient, and distinct. He was surrounded by the finest minds of the age, rhetoricians like Fronto, who tried to teach him the grand, dramatic art of Roman public speaking, and philosophers like Rusticus, who handed him a copy of Epictetus's discourses. It was Rusticus who pulled Marcus away from the seductive traps of clever wordplay and empty intellectualism. He showed the boy that philosophy was not a performative art, but a discipline of the soul, a tool to correct and cure one's character. You can see the tension within the young Marcus as he walks the line between two completely different worlds. On one side is the traditional path of a Roman elite, a career built on public display, political alliances, the climbing of the cursus honorum, and the eventual pursuit of military glory. On the other side is the quiet, inward call of the Stoic path, a life spent examining one's own motives, stripping away the illusions of status, and seeking a tranquil mind that cannot be touched by the chaotic whims of fortune. He preferred the rough wool cloak. He preferred the hard floor. He wanted to be a philosopher. He wanted to disappear into the vast, timeless library of human thought, to spend his days conversing with the dead and mastering his own internal impulses. He found comfort in the idea that the universe was a single, rational organism governed by a grand cosmic reason, the Logos, and that a human being's only true task was to find their proper place within that great design. But the universe, or perhaps the cold mechanics of Roman dynastic politics, had a completely different plan for the quiet boy on the Celian hill. The reigning emperor, Hadrian, was growing old, frail, and increasingly paranoid. He had no biological children, and the problem of the succession was a shadow that hung over the entire empire, threatening to plunge Rome back into the bloody civil wars that had torn it apart in the past. Hadrian was a man of artistic sensibilities, a traveler who had seen every corner of his domains, and he possessed a strange, almost uncanny ability to read the characters of men. One day, while walking through the gardens of the capital, the aging emperor noticed the young Marcus. He did not see a typical, arrogant young aristocrat looking for favor. He saw a boy of absolute, unshakable honesty, a child so incapable of deceit or political flattery that Hadrian playfully nicknamed him Verissimus, meaning the truest one. You can feel the exact moment the trap of history closed around Marcus. Hadrian did not merely admire the boy. He decided to manufacture his destiny. In a series of complex, carefully calculated legal adoptions, Hadrian chose a stable, middle-aged senator named Antoninus Pius to be his immediate successor, but with a strict, non-negotiable condition. Antoninus had to immediately adopt Marcus Aurelius, along with the young Lucius Verus, making them the next heirs to the imperial throne. With a single stroke of a stylus on a legal tablet, the quiet world of the philosopher boy was obliterated. He was no longer a private citizen free to sleep on stone floors and read Greek texts in the shade of his mother's orange trees. He was now a prince of the empire, a piece on the grand chessboard of global power, destined to inherit the absolute rule of over 70 million people. When Marcus received the news of his adoption, he did not celebrate. He did not run to his friends to boast of his incredible fortune. Instead, those who were with him noted that he fell into a deep, heavy melancholy. He wept. He understood, even at that tender age, that the imperial palace was not a place of privilege, but a golden cage. He knew that the purple robe was not a garment of honor, but a shroud that would isolate him from normal human relationships for the rest of his life. He saw the crown for what it truly was, an immense, crushing obligation that would demand the sacrifice of his privacy, his desires, his health, and his beloved philosophy. He moved into the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, but he brought his rough philosopher's mindset with him. He found himself surrounded by the staggering luxury of the court, floors inlaid with exotic marbles from Africa, walls covered in rare tapestries, and tables groaning under the weight of delicacies brought from the edges of the known world. Yet, he lived within these rooms like a guest who was always packed and ready to leave. He refused to let the luxury soften his skin or corrupt his mind. He continued his studies, waking long before dawn to read by lamplight, using the quiet hours of the night to reinforce the internal walls of his character before the madness of the court woke up. The transition from the private world to the public sphere was an agonizingly slow process of psychological conditioning. For over 20 years, Marcus served under his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius. This period was crucial. It was the crucible in which the theoretical philosophy of the boy was forged into the practical statesmanship of the man. Antoninus was the antithesis of the dramatic, warmongering emperors of Rome's past. He was a man of peace, a ruler who never saw a legionary camp, who spent his entire reign within Italy, managing the empire like a vast, careful estate. Marcus watched him with an intensity that borders on devotion. In his writings years later, Marcus would fill pages detailing the virtues of his adoptive father. His unwavering consistency, his calmness in the face of crisis, his indifference to empty honors, his accessibility to ordinary citizens, and his total lack of vanity. Antoninus showed Marcus that it was possible to be an emperor without becoming a tyrant. He demonstrated that power did not have to corrupt if a man possessed a sufficiently clear inner compass. Marcus watched how Antoninus handled the complex finances of the state, how he settled legal disputes with a quiet, rational fairness, and how he maintained his personal simplicity despite the grand theater of the imperial office. It was a long master class in duty. Antoninus was preparing Marcus not to win battles, but to preserve civilization. Yet, during these long decades of preparation, Marcus was also learning the darker, more exhausting realities of power. He spent his days listening to endless, tedious legal arguments, signing hundreds of administrative decrees, and managing the delicate, often hypocritical egos of the Roman Senate. He began to see the human raw material he was destined to rule, not as the noble citizens of Republican myth, but as a fickle, insecure, and self-interested crowd. He began to feel the first creeping chills of a profound, existential isolation. He was surrounded by people every second of the day, secretaries, guard officers, flatterers, and suitors, yet there was no one who could look at him as an equal. He was always the heir, always the future master. You can see the exhaustion building in his letters from this period to his old tutor, Fronto. He writes of his physical fatigue, his chronic stomach pains, and the sheer, mind-numbing boredom of the daily imperial routine. In one letter, he complains of the dust, the noise, and the endless official banquets where he must sit and smile while his mind is miles away, longing for the quiet company of his books. He was a man divided against himself. his intellect pulling him toward the timeless heights of philosophical contemplation, while his duty chained him to the muddy, chaotic realities of human governance. It was during these years that he also experienced the profound personal griefs that would shape his mature Stoic outlook. He married Faustina, the daughter of Antoninus Pius, a woman of intelligence and vitality, but their marriage was quickly shadowed by tragedy. Child after child was born to them, only to sicken and die in infancy. In the ancient world, even the palace could not keep out the dark shadow of infant mortality. Marcus stood over small, cold bodies again and again, watching his bloodline vanish into the earth before it had even begun to bloom. The court expected him to show the traditional, performative grief of a Roman father, or perhaps the cold, unfeeling detachment of a stone statue. But Marcus felt every single loss with a raw, agonizing intensity. He was not a machine. He was a man who loved his children deeply. It was in these moments of profound domestic sorrow that his philosophy was put to its first true test. He had to learn how to weep without despairing. He had to find a way to accept the brutal, indifferent laws of nature that took a child from its cradle, without turning into a bitter, angry cynic. He forced himself to see his children not as possessions that had been stolen from him, but as gifts that had been returned to the universe from which they came. It was a brutal, beautiful act of psychological survival, a lesson he would need to remember when he faced the deaths of thousands on the battlefields of the North. The long rehearsal finally came to an end in the spring of 161. Antoninus Pius, now an old man, lay dying at his ancestral villa in Lorium. He had eaten a dinner of Alpine cheese, vomited during the night, and developed a high fever. As the fever took hold of his mind, he turned to the officer of the guard and gave the final password for the imperial watch: equanimitas, evenness of mind. Then, he turned his face to the wall and quietly slipped away. The weight of the world, carefully prepared for over 20 years, dropped directly onto the shoulders of the 40-year-old Marcus. The Senate met immediately, eager to declare him the sole, absolute ruler of Rome. They expected him to step forward into the light, to claim the title of Augustus, and to take his place as the undisputed master of the earth. But Marcus's first act as emperor shocked the capital and revealed the profound, unconventional depth of his character. He refused the sole rule. He stood before the Senate and insisted that his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, be named co-emperor with completely equal powers. It was an unprecedented move in Roman history, a total rejection of the traditional, murderous jealousy that usually defined the imperial succession. Marcus knew Lucius's flaws. He knew his brother was a man who loved luxury, wine, and the easy pleasures of the theater far more than the hard labor of governance. But Marcus also knew that the empire was too vast for one man to rule alone, and more importantly, he remembered his vow to fairness and familial loyalty. He chose to share the absolute power, dividing the burden of the state, refusing to let the ego of sole rule corrupt his first steps on the throne. You stand beside him as he walks out of the Senate house for the first time as Augustus. The crowds are cheering, throwing flowers in his path, chanting his name as if he were a god who had descended from the heavens to bring a new golden age to Rome. The sun is bright, reflecting off the polished breastplates of his Praetorian Guard, and the city looks magnificent, vast, and indestructible. But Marcus does not hear the cheering. He looks through the crowd, through the marble monuments, and he sees the reality of what lies ahead. He knows that this public triumph is an illusion, a brief, sunny afternoon before the gathering of a terrible storm. He is no longer the boy who slept on the stone floor, but as he feels the heavy silk of the imperial toga pressing against his chest, he knows that the philosopher within him must now become a warrior. The long preparation is over. The true night is about to begin. You are standing on a wooden watchtower overlooking the gray, churning waters of the Danube River. The air here does not smell of orange blossoms or the polished marble of the Celian hill. It smells of rotting pine needles, wet leather, horse sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of iron. A bitter, freezing wind sweeps down from the northern forests, cutting through the thickest wool cloaks and biting into the skin of the men who stand guard at the edge of civilization. This is the frontier. Below you, thousands of Roman legionaries are moving through the mud like industrious ants, hauling heavy timbers, sharpening defensive stakes, and fortifying a line that feels entirely too thin to hold back the tide of human desperation massing on the other side. This is the reality that greeted Marcus Aurelius almost immediately after he ascended the throne. The long, sunny afternoon of the Antonine Peace was over. The universe, which Marcus had so beautifully described in his youth as a rational, harmonious organism, seemed to have suddenly turned its face away from Rome, unleashing a succession of catastrophes that would have broken any ruler guided by vanity alone. First came the floods. The Tiber River burst its banks with unprecedented fury, sweeping away the granaries of the capital, drowning the livestock, and threatening the city with immediate, widespread famine. Marcus did not panic. He did not lock himself in his palace to pray or blame scapegoat. He organized the grain supply, emptied his own estates to feed the poor, and personally supervised the distribution of relief. But the waters had barely receded when the Real storm broke in the east. The Parthian Empire, Rome's ancient and bitter rival, saw the transition of power to a philosopher king as an opportunity. They struck without warning, wiping out a Roman legion in the valleys of Armenia, invading Syria, and slaughtering the Roman governors who tried to oppose them. The golden cage of the Palatine Hill was suddenly busted open. Marcus, who had spent his entire life preparing to manage a peaceful state, was forced to become a war leader. He made the difficult, strategic decision to send his co-emperor, Lucius Verus, to the eastern front to command the armies, while he remained in Rome to manage the collapsing home front and ensure the wheels of logistics kept turning. You watch Marcus as he walks through the military headquarters in Rome, his desk now covered not with legal philosophy or Greek poetry, but with troop movements, supply requisitions, and estimates of iron production. His brother Lucius was not a natural general. He preferred the luxurious safety of the villas in Antioch to the mud of the trenches, but Marcus managed him with an extraordinary, stoic patience. He wrote letters of encouragement, sent his best commanders, men like the brilliant Avidius Cassius, to actually run the campaigns, and quietly ensured that the legions were fed, armed, and reinforced. The war in the East lasted for 4 grueling years. It was an agonizing exercise in long-distance crisis management for Marcus. Every day, he had to wait weeks for news to travel across the Mediterranean, knowing that a single tactical blunder could open the provinces of Asia Minor to invasion. He learned to live with uncertainty, to master the rising panic in his chest when a messenger arrived with blood on his boots. He forced himself to apply his philosophical principles to the brutal mechanics of empire building, reminding himself that every soldier who died was a part of the same cosmic whole, and that his duty was simply to perform his role with absolute, unyielding integrity. In 165, the Roman legions finally broke the back of the Parthian resistance. They marched deep into Mesopotamia, sacked the great twin capitals of Seleucia and Ctesiphon, and forced the Parthian king to sue for peace. It was a massive, spectacular victory. In the streets of Rome, the people went wild with joy. They prepared for a triumph the likes of which had not been seen in a generation. Lucius Verus returned to the west covered in glory, his wagons loaded down with gold, jewels, and thousands of foreign captives. The empire seemed to have triumphed over its enemies. The gods seemed to have vindicated the philosopher king. But as the victorious legions marched back along the Roman roads, they carried something far more lethal than gold in their baggage. They carried the plague. You can see the exact moment the triumph turned into an apocalypse. It began in the crowded military camps of Asia Minor, a soldier coughing up dark blood, a sudden, burning fever that turned the skin black with pustules, a quiet death in the middle of the night. By the time the legions reached the European provinces, The disease was spreading like wildfire along the trade routes. It entered Rome through the port of Ostia, hitching a ride on the grain ships, and exploded into the densely packed insulae of the capital. The city that had just been cheering for victory was suddenly transformed into a vast, open-air morgue. The death toll was catastrophic. In some areas, entire neighborhoods were completely wiped out within weeks. The economy, already strained by years of Eastern warfare, collapsed into a dead halt. The tax revenues dried up, the farms were abandoned as the peasants died in their fields, and the silver content of the Roman denarius had to be drastically debased just to keep the state solvent. And then, the ultimate nightmare materialized in the north. The Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Iazyges, who had been watching the Roman borders for decades, realized that the legions guarding the Danube were dying in their barracks. Driven by their own desperate pressures from migrating peoples further north, and seeing the Roman line weakened by pestilence, they crossed the frozen river in an avalanche of iron and fire. They smashed through the border forts, cut the defending legions to pieces, and poured into the rich provinces of Pannonia and Noricum. For the first time in nearly 3 centuries, barbarian war parties crossed the Alps and laid siege to an Italian city, Aquileia. The heartland of the empire was exposed. The panic in Rome was absolute. The people believed the end of the world had arrived. They crowded the temples, screaming for mercy, performing bizarre, desperate rituals, and looking for someone to blame. The Senate sat in paralyzed silence, terrified by the twin specters of a foreign invasion and an invisible disease that was killing their own families. They looked to Marcus Aurelius. The philosopher who had spent his youth reading in the shade of orange trees was now expected to save an empire that was bleeding from every pore. You stand beside Marcus in the private chambers of the palace as he prepares to make a choice that would define his legacy. The treasury was empty. The army was decimated by the plague. The people were too terrified to enlist. Anyone else would have despaired, or perhaps gathered the remaining guards to defend the walls of Rome, leaving the provinces to their fate. But Marcus looked at the crisis with the cold, diagnostic eye of a physician. He knew that panic was a luxury he could not afford. His first move was a radical act of financial humility. He refused to raise taxes on an already suffering population. Instead, he ordered a massive public auction of the imperial palace's private treasures. For 2 solid months, the courtyards of the Forum of Trajan were filled with the personal luxuries of the emperors. Golden cups, silk robes embroidered with gold thread, rare crystal vessels, ancient statues, and even the private jewelry of his wife, Faustina. Marcus stood by, watching calmly as his family's inheritance was sold off to the highest bidder. He did not care about the loss of status. To a Stoic, gold was nothing but yellow dirt, and luxury was an illusion that rotted the soul. The only real value lay in using those resources to protect human life. With the funds raised from the auction, he began a desperate, unconventional mobilization effort. He needed men, but the traditional citizen pools were empty. So, Marcus broke with centuries of Roman military tradition. He emancipated thousands of slaves and formed them into special legions, promising them freedom in exchange for their blood. He enlisted the Latrones, the bandits and highwaymen who infested the mountains of Italy, turning their criminal violence into an instrument of state defense. He hired thousands of German mercenaries, pitting his enemies against one another, and even weaponized the imperial gladiators, much to the fury of the Roman crowd who complained that the emperor was robbing them of their entertainment. Marcus did not care about the complaint. He was building a machine out of scraps, a desperate, makeshift army designed to do one thing: hold the line. In the autumn of 169, he left Rome behind. He took off the comfortable toga of the civil administrator and put on the heavy, iron-studded leather of a Roman general. He marched north toward the Danube, accompanied by his brother Lucius Verus. But fate was not done testing him. On the road north, near the town of Altinum, Lucius Verus suffered a sudden, massive stroke, likely brought on by the early stages of the plague or his years of heavy drinking. He collapsed in Marcus's arms, his speech failing him, and died 3 days later. You can feel the crushing weight of this new loneliness. Marcus had to return to Rome to bury his brother, to escort the body back to the mausoleum of Hadrian, and to comfort a grieving court. He was now truly alone at the top of the pyramid. There was no co-emperor to share the blame, no brother to lean on during the long nights. Every decision, every life lost, every administrative failure would now rest squarely on his head. Yet, after the funeral games were concluded, he did not linger in the capital. He turned his horse back toward the north, riding through the winter mud toward the front lines. He would not see Rome again for nearly 8 long, bloody years. When he arrived at the military headquarters of Carnuntum on the Danube, the situation was grim beyond description. The legions were living in damp, disease-ridden wooden huts, surrounded by a landscape of black earth, gray skies, and endless snow. The enemy was not an organized empire like Parthia, but a shifting, terrifying coalition of fierce tribesmen who fought with a fanatical, guerrilla ferocity. They did not fight in neat lines. They melted into the swamps, ambushed supply columns from the thick forests, and vanished before the heavy Roman infantry could bring them to bear. This was the environment in which Marcus Aurelius spent his 50s, not in a comfortable study, but in a drafty leather tent, listening to the coughing of his dying soldiers and the distant howling of wolves across the frozen river. He had to learn the dirty, unglamorous mechanics of border warfare, building bridgeheads, managing supply lines through frozen waterways, negotiating treacherous treaties with duplicitous tribal chieftains, and ordering the execution of prisoners when necessary for military discipline. You watch him sit by his small camp stove in the dead of winter, his hands wrapped around a cup of warm water, his body aching from the damp cold that exacerbated his chronic illnesses. His stomach was a constant source of agony. The ulcers and chest pains made it difficult for him to eat anything but a few bites of bread and a small dose of Galen's medicine. Yet, when his officers entered the tent, they did not see a sick man. They saw an iron statue. He listened to their reports with an unshakable, tranquil focus, his voice calm, his decisions clear and decisive. It was during these brutal northern campaigns, surrounded by the screams of the wounded and the daily horror of a war of attrition, that Marcus wrote the vast majority of his meditations. He did not write them for publication. He did not think anyone would ever read them. They were his late-night therapy sessions, a way to wash his mind clean of the blood and mud of the day before he closed his eyes to sleep. You can hear the raw, honest internal dialogue in his words from this period. He reminds himself not to become brutalized by the violence around him. He writes, "Take care that you do not feel towards the inhuman as they feel towards men." He looked at the barbarian enemies he was fighting not with hatred, but with a profound, detached understanding. They were human beings acting out of their own nature, driven by hunger, fear, and the desire to protect their own families. They were wrong, from the perspective of Roman order, but they were not evil. They were simply a part of the chaotic, shifting currents of the Logos. He used his philosophy to strip the grand theater of war of its romantic illusions. When his generals brought him news of a great victory, describing how they had slaughtered thousands of Germans in a swamp, Marcus would write to himself that a triumph is nothing but a spider proud of catching a fly. He saw through the gold medals, the laurel wreaths, and the official praise, recognizing that every victory was just a temporary patch on a leaky vessel, an agonizing expenditure of human life that would eventually be swallowed by the oblivion of time. The climax of these northern wars came in the summer of 172, during a campaign deep inside the territory of the Quadi. A large Roman force, accompanied by Marcus himself, was lured into a narrow, arid valley, surrounded on all sides by the enemy, and completely cut off from their water supply. The heat was oppressive, the dust suffocating, and the soldiers were soon paralyzed by a burning thirst, their energy draining away as the German tribesmen gathered on the ridges above, waiting for the final, easy slaughter. You can feel the absolute, breathless despair of that afternoon. The Roman commanders were preparing for an honorable suicide. The soldiers were dropping their shields, too weak to hold their weapons. Marcus stood among them, his own throat parched, his body exhausted, looking up at the cliffs where the enemy's spears gleamed in the hot sun. He had reached the absolute limit of his human power. He could not make it rain. He could not conjure legions out of the dust. And then the sky turned black. A sudden, violent thunderstorm erupted directly over the valley. It was not a gentle shower, but a torrential downpour, accompanied by terrifying bolts of lightning and massive hail. The Roman soldiers threw back their heads, opening their mouths to catch the freezing water, filling their helmets and shields to drink even as the storm crashed around them. But the lightning fell directly onto the positions of the Quadi on the ridges, setting their wooden defenses on fire and throwing their ranks into a blind, superstitious panic. The Romans, revitalized by the water and believing the gods themselves had intervened, charged up the muddy slopes through the smoke and fire, breaking the enemy lines and turning in certain disaster into a spectacular, miraculous victory. History would remember this event as the miracle of the rain, and it would be carved into the stone of the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, depicting a massive, winged deity raining water down onto the soldiers. But Marcus did not see himself as a favorite of the gods. When the army hailed him as imperator for the 7th time on that muddy battlefield, he simply accepted the honor with his usual, quiet humility. He knew that the rain was a natural phenomenon, a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a demonstration of the wild, unpredictable power of the universe that cared nothing for human definitions of victory or defeat. He had survived, his men had survived, but the war was not over. The ascent was complete, but the pinnacle of his isolation was yet to come. You are sitting at the edge of a collapsed earthwork at midnight, listening to the agonizingly slow rhythm of the northern world. The Danube has begun to freeze again, its surface skinning over with a milky, jagged ice that groans and pops under the immense pressure of the current beneath. The sound travels through the frozen mud, up through the soles of your boots, vibrating like a low, discordant note played on an instrument of iron and stone. In the camp behind you, the fires are low, casting long, skeletal shadows against the canvas of the imperial tent. The soldiers are too exhausted to talk. They huddle together in groups of 3 or 4, sharing the residual warmth of their bodies, their breath rising in short, white puffs that vanish instantly into the black air. Inside the tent, the silence is of a completely different quality. It is not the silence of rest, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a man who has climbed to the absolute peak of human authority and found that there is nothing there but wind. Marcus Aurelius is sitting on a small, camp stool, his body folded forward over his knees, his forehead resting against his palm. The oil lamp on his table is sputtering, its wick drowning in a pool of cheap, bitter tallow that smells of slaughtered pigs. He is 54 years old now, but his face is an architectural map of sorrow. The deep, vertical lines between his brows are permanently etched into his skin, and his silver beard is stained yellow around the mouth from the herbal syrups he drinks to stop the vomiting. He is completely, irreversibly alone. You watch him reach out to touch a stack of official letters that arrived at dusk from the southern ports. The wax seals are broken, their red fragments scattered across the floor like drops of dried blood. These letters do not contain news of military maneuvers or supply numbers. They are personal reports from his agents in Rome, detailed accounts of what his oldest friends, his trusted senators, and even his own family say about him when they think he is too far away to hear. To be the master of the world is to live in a house made of glass where every reflection is a lie. For more than a decade, Marcus has lived with the knowledge that every smile offered to him is a calculated political investment, every expression of grief an administrative performance, and every word of praise a thin layer of sugar meant to hide the poison of ambition. The people who surround him do not see a man. They see an intersection of legal privileges, a source of signatures, a fountain of wealth that must be kept flowing at all costs. He picks up his reed pen, his knuckles white and swollen from the winter damp, and writes a single sentence that feels like a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. A man can stand upright. He does not need to be kept upright by others. This is the psychological core of his isolation. He has realized that if he relies on the understanding, the gratitude, or the love of those he rules, he will drown. The Roman Senate, which he has treated with an unprecedented, republican respect, views his philosophical humility not as a virtue, but as a weakness to be exploited. They long for the old days of theatrical violence, for an emperor who would throw massive games, hand out golden coins like water, and murder their political rivals to clear a path for their own advancement. They do not understand a man who sits in a mud-walled fort, reviewing legal documents with an obsession for justice, refusing to execute men without a trial, and treating the barbarian captives with the same legal fairness he would show to a patrician. The letters from Rome contain darker, more intimate shadows. They speak of his wife, Faustina. Rumors are spreading through the capital like the grease from a sacrificial altar, whispers that she has grown tired of her husband's cold, philosophical nobility, that she is taking lovers from the ranks of the gladiators and the young actors, and that she is quietly preparing for a world where Marcus does not return from the northern snows. You can feel the sharp, human sting of this betrayal as Marcus reads the reports. He does not yell. He does not call for his executioners or order his guards to bring her to the front in chains. He closes his eyes and forces his mind to perform the brutal, clinical surgery that his philosophy demands. He strips the rumor of its emotional weight. What is a wife's infidelity? It is the movement of one body toward another, driven by the same natural, biological impulses that govern the beasts in the forest. If he allows himself to be humiliated by it, he is allowing his happiness to be dependent on the actions of another person, a fundamental violation of the Stoic code. He writes to himself, his script small and crowded on the papyrus. Say to yourself in the morning, I shall meet with people who are interfering, ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial. All these things happen to them by reason of their ignorance of what is good and evil. He does not hate Faustina for her coldness, nor does he hate the senators for their plotting. He looks at them with a profound, almost terrifying pity. They are blind men stumbling through a dark room, breaking things because they cannot see the light of the logos. They think that wealth, pleasure, and power are real goods, and so they lie, cheat, and betray to get them. Marcus understands that their corruption is not an attack on him. It is a sickness of their own souls. And a physician does not get angry at a patient for having a fever. But the illusion of control was about to be shattered by a blow that came from his closest friend, a man he loved like a brother. In the spring of 175, a rumor swept through the eastern provinces of the empire that Marcus Aurelius was dead. The report was false, likely born of the extreme secrecy surrounding the emperor's failing health and his long absences beyond the Danube. But in the great city of Antioch, the governor of the East, Avidius Cassius, the brilliant, charismatic general who had won the Parthian War for Marcus, did not wait for confirmation. He stepped into the public forum, wrapped himself in the imperial purple, and declared himself Augustus. The betrayal was total. Cassius was not just a general. He was the sword of the empire in the east, the man Marcus had trusted with absolute command over half the Roman world while he was occupied in the north. More terrifyingly, the rumors suggested that Faustina herself had secretly written to Cassius, offering her hand in marriage and the throne of Rome if her husband died, desperate to secure her own survival before the northern legions could march south to install a rival. You stand in the war tent as the news is delivered to Marcus by an exhausted horse courier whose mount dropped dead in the camp gates. The officers of his staff are pale, their hands twitching toward their sword hilts. They expect an immediate, bloody fury. They expect the emperor to order the entire northern army to turn around, to abandon the frontier, and to march on the east with fire and sword to exterminate the traitor and everyone who looked at him. Instead, Marcus sits in silence for a long time, the paper in his hands completely still. When he finally speaks, his voice is lower than usual, but it carries a terrifying, crystalline clarity. He does not curse Cassius. He does not weep for his wife's complicity. He calls a meeting of his soldiers, not to whip them into a frenzy of vengeance, but to explain the situation with the honesty of a schoolmaster. "My fellow soldiers," he says, standing before the ranks of grizzled, mud-stained legionaries under a gray sky, "I have not come before you to express anger, but sorrow. A man who was my friend, a man whom I trusted with the safety of our eastern borders, has turned against me, and he has done so not because I have wronged him, but because he believes the throne is an empty prize to be taken by the strongest." He looks out over the thousands of iron helmets, his eyes steady. "I have no desire to see Roman blood spilled against Roman blood. If it were possible, I would gladly stand before Cassius in single combat, or step down from this office entirely, if it would preserve the peace of our people. But the state cannot be left without a pilot in the middle of a storm. We must march east, not to destroy an enemy, but to correct a brother who has lost his way." You can feel the profound, exhausting psychological weight of this moment. Marcus was being forced to fight a civil war he did not want, to pull resources away from the vulnerable northern border where the Germanic tribes were still massing, all to defend a crown he had never desired in the first place. He marched his army south, through the Balkan passes, his mind focused entirely on a single goal. He wanted to capture Cassius alive. He wanted to forgive him. He wanted to show the world an example of stoic mercy, to prove that absolute power could be matched by absolute magnanimity. He wrote in his journal during that long march toward the sun, "The best revenge is to not be like your enemy." But the universe denied him even this small, philosophical victory. Before Marcus's legions could reach the borders of Syria, a lone centurion in Cassius's own camp, realizing that the rebellion was doomed and seeking to buy his own safety, walked into the usurper's tent during midday and cut his throat. Cassius's head was severed from his shoulders, packed in salt, and sent north by courier to be laid at the feet of the emperor. When the wicker basket containing the head of his friend was brought into Marcus's tent, he refused to look at it. He ordered the courier to remove it immediately and commanded that the head be buried with full military honors in an unmarked grave. He did not celebrate. He did not order the execution of Cassius's children or the slaughter of the senators who had supported the rebellion in the east. He wrote a letter to the Roman Senate, his words a striking contrast to the usual bloody purges that followed a failed coup. "I implore you, let no member of the Senate be put to death because of this rebellion. Let the children of Avidius Cassius live in safety, and let their property be returned to them. May it never be said that under my rule, a man was killed for wanting to be emperor." He then traveled through the eastern provinces himself, visiting Antioch, Alexandria, and Athens, not as a conqueror seeking vengeance, but as a priest of reconciliation. He walked through the streets without a guard, spoke with the local magistrates who had declared for his rival, and burned all of Cassius's private correspondence without reading it, so he would never know the names of those who had betrayed him. He did not want to carry the weight of their guilt in his memory. He wanted his mind to remain clean, unpoisoned by suspicion. It was during this journey through the east, while staying at a small, remote village in Cappadocia called Halala, that Faustina finally succumbed to a sudden, violent illness. She died in her bed, far from the luxury of Rome, with only her tired husband sitting beside her. You watch Marcus as he sits by her cooling body. The rumors of her betrayals, her letters to Cassius, her infidelity, all of it vanishes into the cold reality of her stillness. She was the mother of his 11 children. She had shared the golden cage with him for 30 years. He did not allow bitterness to corrupt his grief. He wept for her as a man weeps for the loss of his youth, and he wrote to the Senate asking them to divine her name, to build a temple in her honor at the village where she died, and to establish a charity for poor young girls in her memory. He returned to Rome in the winter of 176, celebrating a formal triumph that felt like a funeral procession to his own soul. The citizens cheered, the Senate gave him golden crowns, and his young son, Commodus, sat beside him in the chariot, dressed in the miniature armor of a prince. Commodus was now 15, the only surviving son of Marcus's large family, the remaining heir to the greatest empire on earth. And here lies the ultimate, tragic pinnacle of Marcus's isolation. He looked at his son, and he saw a stranger. Commodus was not like the boy who had slept on the stone floor of the Celian hill. He was handsome, physically powerful, and completely corrupted by the sycophancy of the court. He cared nothing for philosophy. He found the discourses of Epictetus boring and the daily labor of legal administration an insufferable chore. He loved the gladiatorial games with a fanatical, unhealthy passion, spending his days with the trainers and the beast fighters, dreaming of the day when he could step into the arena himself to kill animals before the screaming crowd. Marcus saw all of this. He was an expert reader of human character, a man who had spent his life analyzing the internal motives of men. He knew that his son was weak, vain, and entirely unsuited to hold the absolute power of the state. He knew that if Commodus became sole emperor, the long, stable peace of the Antonine era would dissolve into a madness of blood and tyranny. Yet Marcus was trapped by the very history he had spent his life trying to manage. If he disinherited Commodus, if he chose a more capable senator to be his successor as Hadrian had done for him, it would mean an immediate, inevitable civil war the moment he closed his eyes. The legions would not accept a stranger over the biological son of a deified emperor. Commodus's supporters would rise, the provinces would be divided, and the empire would bleed to death from within while the Germans crossed the Danube. You can feel the immense, silent agony of this dilemma as Marcus walks through the imperial library in Rome, his shadow stretching long across the marble floor. Every choice available to him was a disaster. To give the empire to his son was to risk a tyranny, to take it away was to guarantee a civil war. He was a father who loved his son, and he was an emperor who owed his life to the common good, and the two roles were in a state of permanent, irreconcilable warfare. He chose the path of stability, hoping against all his own philosophical observations that responsibility would mature the boy. He named Commodus co-emperor, bringing him along to the northern front when the Germanic wars flared up again in 178, keeping him close where he could monitor him, guide him, and try to inject a fraction of his own discipline into the boy's fluid, unstable mind. Now, back on the frozen Danube, the hours of his life are winding down like the oil in his lamp. The world outside his tent is still cold, still dark, still full of enemies. He looks out the flap of his canvas into the freezing night, his body shivering, his mind perfectly still. He has achieved everything a man could achieve. He has saved his people, he has defeated his enemies, he has preserved the laws of Rome. And yet, he has nothing. He is surrounded by an army that worships him, a senate that fears him, and a son who is waiting for him to die, and there is not a single soul on earth who truly knows him. He returns to his table, takes up his pen, and prepares to write the final thoughts of a long, lonely night. He does not ask for comfort. He does not complain about his fate. He simply prepares himself for the final, inevitable breaking of the instrument. You are listening to the sound of a human lung collapsing in the dark. It is a wet, rattling sound, like the last remnants of water being drawn from a deep, muddy well. The air inside the imperial military quarters at Vindobona, the modern city of Vienna, is thick with the smell of vinegar-soaked rags, old sweat, stale wine, and the pungent, unmistakable odor of an infected body that has begun to shut down from within. Outside the heavy timber walls of the command villa, A relentless, freezing rain is falling, turning the military camp into a lake of gray mud and slick ice. The wind howls through the gaps in the slate roof, but inside this room, the air is perfectly stagnant, trapped around the small bed where the master of the world is spending his final days. It is March of the year 180. The Antonine Plague, which had seemed to retreat into the shadows for a few brief years, has returned with a cold, vengeful fury to the northern camps. It has bypassed the outer defenses, ignored the guards at the gate, and found its way into the chest of the emperor. Marcus Aurelius is dying. He lies beneath a mountain of heavy woolen blankets, yet his body shivers with a rhythmic, violent intensity that makes the wooden frame of his bed creak in the silence. His skin, once pale and clear, is now covered in the dark, purple-black hemorrhages of the pestilence. His breathing is shallow, a desperate, rapid panting that barely manages to bring enough air into his scarred lungs to keep his heart beating. He is 58 years old, but as you look at his face by the guttering light of a single bronze oil lamp, he looks like an ancient relic carved from gray stone, a monument that has been left out in the rain for centuries until all its sharp edges have been worn away. You watch as his personal physician, a silent, dark-eyed Greek trained in the school of Galen, steps forward to wipe a line of dark, thin blood from the emperor's silver beard. The physician knows there is nothing left to do. The theriac, the opium-laced syrup that had kept Marcus's chronic stomach pains at bay for 20 years, can no longer dull this kind of agony. The body is simply refusing to fight. It has been worked too hard, marched too far through the winter snows, and carried too many tons of administrative and emotional anxiety for too many years. The instrument is breaking, and both the doctor and the patient know it. But Marcus's mind remains an island of absolute clarity amidst the rising tide of his physical collapse. He does not allow the delirium of the fever to steal his focus. When his eyes open, they are not wild or terrified. They are steady, heavy with an immense, ancient wisdom, looking at the room around him with the same detached, clinical curiosity he used when examining a legal contract or a troop movement. He is thinking about the empire he is leaving behind. He knows that the grand structure he spent his life defending is already fracturing, its joints groaning under pressures that no military victory can fix. He looks through the timber walls of his room, through the northern rain, and he sees a world that is fundamentally changing. The long, beautiful illusion of the Pax Romana, the belief that Rome had created a permanent, unchanging space of civilization that would endure forever, is dead. It died in the mass graves of the plague. It died in the burned-out villas of Pannonia. It died the moment a Roman general turned his sword against his own emperor in the east. He realizes that his entire reign has been a long rearguard action against the inevitable decay of time. He has not built a new empire. He has simply held the doors shut against an ocean of chaos that is screaming to get in. And now, his hands are slipping from the bronze handles. The door to the chamber creaks open, letting in a draught of cold, wet air that makes the flame of the oil lamp jump and dance against the wall. A young man steps into the room, his boots clicking loudly against the stone floor. This is Commodus. He is 19 years old now, his body tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating the arrogant, thoughtless health of a youth who has never known physical suffering or structural responsibility. His hair is curled, his skin is bright, and he wears an embroidered military cloak that is entirely too clean for a camp on the Danube frontier. He looks at his dying father not with the grief of a son, but with the nervous, impatient anxiety of a prince who is waiting for a crown to fall into his lap. He hates this room. He hates the smell of sickness, the endless philosophical discussions, the gray skies of the north, and the serious, unsmiling faces of his father's advisers. He longs for the bright sun of Rome, for the cheering crowds of the Colosseum, for the smell of perfumes and the easy, unthinking pleasures of the imperial palace. Marcus looks up at his son through his clouded eyes. You can feel the profound, heartbreaking tragedy of this final meeting. Marcus knows exactly who his son is. He has watched him closely during these last 2 years on the frontier, trying to teach him the art of governance, trying to force him to sit through the long legal audiences and the dry briefings on border security. And he has seen the boy's mind drift every single time, his eyes searching the window, his fingers twitching as if he were holding a wooden sword in the arena. Marcus knows that the moment he dies, Commodus will abandon the war. He will sign a hasty, shameful peace with the Germanic tribes, turn his horse south, and abandon the frontier that thousands of Roman soldiers died to secure, all so he can run back to the luxuries of the capital. The work of 8 years, the lives of entire legions, the defensive line of the Danube, all of it will be sacrificed to his son's vanity. You watch Marcus lift a trembling, black-spotted hand from beneath the blanket. He signals for his advisors, his generals, and his oldest friends to enter the room. They file in silently, their faces dark with grief and exhaustion. Men like Pompeianus, the brilliant general from Syria who had married Marcus's daughter Lucilla, and Victorinus, the prefect who had stood by the emperor through the darkest days of the plague. These are the gray-bearded pillars of the state, the men who understand the true weight of the empire. They gather around the bed, their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the small, broken figure of their master. Marcus looks at them one by one. He does not ask them to weep for him. He does not want their performances of sorrow. He speaks to them in a voice that is nothing but a dry whisper, yet it carries the absolute authority of a man who is already looking at the world from the other side of existence. "Why do you weep for me?" he whispers, his breath catching in his throat, "and not rather think of the pestilence and the common death that awaits us all? If you love me, do not waste your tears on a garment that is being discarded. Look to the boy. Look to the empire. I am leaving you a heavy burden, a ship in the middle of a rocky strait. Do not let it founder because the pilot has changed." He takes his son's hand, his cold, rough fingers closing around the soft, uncalloused skin of the youth. "My son," Marcus says, forcing his eyes to lock with the boy's shifting glance, "finish the work. Do not abandon the camps until the river is secure. Do not trust the flatterers who will surround your throne the moment I am gone. Remember that an emperor is nothing but a servant of the laws, a man who belongs to the state, not a master who owns it." Commodus nods quickly, his face a mask of superficial respect, promising everything his father asks, but his mind is already miles away, calculating the days it will take to ride from Vindobona to the Italian border. Marcus sees the lie in his son's eyes. He sees it clearly, without anger, but with an immense, crushing sorrow that is heavier than the disease killing his lungs. He realizes that his final act as emperor, leaving his son on the throne, is a catastrophic failure of his duty to Rome. Yet it is a failure forced upon him by the brutal, unyielding mechanics of human history. He is trapped between his love as a father and his duty as a ruler, and the universe has broken him across that exact line. He dismisses them all. He asks his son to leave, his friends to retire, and his advisors to return to their posts. He wants to spend his final hours the way he spent his long nights, in absolute, uninterrupted solitude. He wants to face the dark alone, without the distractions of human pretense or political theater. The room empties, the heavy oak door clicking shut for the last time. The silence returns, vast, heavy, and cold, broken only by the steady, rhythmic sound of the freezing rain against the window pane. Marcus lies back on his thin pillow, his eyes fixed on the ceiling where the soot from the oil lamp has created a dark, circular cloud. He is thinking about the concept of the logos, the grand, cosmic reason that he had trusted since he was a boy sleeping on the stone floors of Rome. For his entire life, he had forced himself to believe that everything that happens in the universe is good, because it is part of a larger, rational design. He had told himself that the plague, the wars, the betrayals, and the deaths of his children were all necessary steps in the great dance of nature, elements being broken down and rebuilt to keep the world alive. But now, as the coldness of death begins to crawl up his legs, entering his chest like liquid ice, that beautiful philosophy is put to its ultimate, agonizing test. He looks at his fracturing empire, at his corrupted son, at his own ruined body, and he must find the strength to say, "This too is right. This too is part of the design." It is an act of supreme intellectual courage. He refuses to curse the universe. He refuses to give in to the easy, comforting bitterness of despair. He reminds himself that he is just a single actor in a play that was written long before he was born, and his only task is to play his final scene with dignity, without throwing his script at the director. The night deepens, the hours stretching out like the long, dark shadows of the northern forests. Marcus's breathing becomes slower, the gaps between his gasps widening into terrifying chasms of silence where you think he will never breathe again. His mind begins to float away from his body, drifting back through the decades of his life, away from the mud of the Danube, away from the administrative desks of Rome, back toward the sun-drenched garden of his youth on the Celian hill. He sees his mother sitting beneath the orange trees, her hands smelling of wet earth and lavender. He sees his grandfather walking through the clean white atrium, his voice steady and calm. He sees his small children who died in their cradles, their faces clear and unspotted by the sickness of the world, reaching out to him with small, warm hands. He realizes that all of it, the joy and the sorrow, the victory and the betrayal, the gold of the triumph and the black blood of the plague, is already gone. It is nothing but a ghost story told to a man who is about to wake up from a long, confusing dream. In the early morning hours, just before the first gray light of dawn can penetrate the thick northern mist, the officer of the Imperial Guard steps into the room to ask the Emperor for the final password of the night. It is the same ritual that has happened every single day of his 20-year reign, the military machine of Rome demanding its daily breath from the man at the top. Marcus turns his head slowly on the pillow. His lips are cracked, his tongue dry and heavy with blood. He looks at the officer, a grizzled veteran who has fought beside him in the mud for 8 years, and he speaks his final word to the world, his voice nothing but a faint rustle of wind through dry leaves. "Go to the rising sun," Marcus whispers, his eyes closing, "for my sun is already setting." The officer bows, his eyes wet with tears, and steps out of the room. A few moments later, the breathing stops. The shivering ceases. The pale, scarred hand that had written the meditations falls limp against the rough wool of the blanket, its fingers uncurling like the petals of a dying flower. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the good emperors, is dead. And with him, the golden age of Rome dies too, leaving the empire to tumble headlong into a dark, fractured night from which it will never truly awaken. You are walking through the Roman Forum 2,000 years after the last legionary camp at Vindobona was swallowed by the earth. It is midnight, and the moon hangs low and pale over the broken spine of the Via Sacra, casting long, fractured shadows through the skeletal remains of temples that once dictated the fate of the known world. The white marble that Marcus Aurelius gazed upon has long since turned into gray, weathered limestone, pitted by time, blackened by the soot of medieval fires, and buried under yards of modern dirt. The great bronze statues of his ancestors have been melted down into coins, cannonballs, and church bells. Yet, as the modern city hums with a distant electric vibration beyond the archaeological ruins, you can still feel the heavy, persistent resonance of the man who died in the northern rain. He did not leave behind a line of stable heirs, nor did he build an empire that could withstand the slow, grinding machinery of human decay. What remains of him is not made of stone or bronze. It is something far more fragile and entirely more indestructible, a collection of private thoughts, scrawled on stained papyrus by the light of a guttering oil lamp, surviving through the wreckage of centuries by a series of absolute miracles. To understand the modern legacy of Marcus Aurelius, you must watch how the myth separated from the man, and how a private diary meant for the flames became a lighthouse for a drowning species. You watch the immediate aftermath of his departure from the stage of history. When the body of Marcus Aurelius was brought back to Rome, the city did not merely mourn an emperor, they deified a father. The citizens refused to look at his death as a political transition. They carved his life into the massive stone spirals of the Aurelian column, showing his victories over the Marcomanni and the miracle of the rain, but the people did not need a monument to remember him. History records that for decades after his death, nearly every home in Rome that could afford it kept a small, plaster or marble bust of Marcus among their household gods. In a world that was rapidly sliding into the chaotic madness of his son Commodus's reign, the image of the unsmiling, bearded philosopher was a silent comfort, a reminder that there had once been a time when justice sat upon the throne. The decline was swift, brutal, and exactly as Marcus had feared. Commodus did not finish the work on the Danube. He signed a hasty, compromise treaty with the Germanic tribes, turned his back on the frontier, and rushed to Rome to indulge in an orgy of self-glorification. He renamed the months of the year after his own titles. He renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana. He abandoned the administrative desks to his corrupt favorites and stepped into the arena as a gladiator, demanding that the Senate cheer for him as he slaughtered helpless animals and disabled citizens from the safety of the imperial box. The stable world that Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius had spent 40 years preserving was broken within a decade. Commodus was eventually strangled to death in his bath by his wrestling partner, plunging Rome into the Year of the Five Emperors, a bloody, chaotic cycle of civil wars, military coups, and economic collapse that marked the true beginning of the end for the Western Empire. The Golden Age was over. The night had arrived. But while the political structure of Rome was fracturing into pieces, the small leather-bound journal that Marcus had kept in his war tent was beginning its own quiet, underground journey through time. It had no title. Marcus had never intended for it to be read by his senators, his subjects, or his children. He had written it to himself, for himself, an internal dialogue between his flawed human ego and his rational soul. He had likely left orders for it to be burned after his death, an unnecessary luxury for a man who believed that fame was nothing but empty air. Yet someone saved it. A secretary, a loyal general, or perhaps a grieving daughter quietly pulled the papyrus sheets from the imperial baggage before it was consumed by the funeral pyre. For centuries, the text existed in the deepest shadows of the ancient world, a hidden manuscript passed from hand to hand among a select few who valued the old wisdom. It was mentioned only rarely by ancient writers, a brief nod by the historian Herodian, a quiet reference in the speeches of the Emperor Julian. You can feel the terrifying precarity of its survival. During the Dark Ages, when the great libraries of Alexandria and Rome were burned, when the Western Empire collapsed under the weight of successive barbarian invasions, and when literacy itself shrank to a tiny flicker in isolated monasteries, the Meditations almost vanished entirely from the human record. The text was reduced to a few scattered copies hidden away in the libraries of the Byzantine Empire, forgotten under centuries of dust, surviving the sacks of Constantinople and the religious purges of the medieval world. It was not until the Renaissance, more than 1,300 years after Marcus's death, that the book finally stepped back into the light of global consciousness. It was printed for the first time in 1559 in Zurich, translated from its original, precise Greek into Latin, and suddenly, the voice of the dead emperor spoke directly to a modern world that was wrestling with its own crises of faith, power, and existential stability. The effect was profound. The world had seen many books written by philosophers about how kings should rule, but they had never seen a book written by a king about how he tried to rule himself. The Meditations bypassed the academic debates of the universities and went straight to the hearts of individuals who were carrying their own heavy burdens. You see the long, diverse line of human minds that turned to Marcus Aurelius for strength during their own darkest night. Leaders, writers, artists, and soldiers found an uncanny, timeless companionship in the thoughts of the Roman emperor. When Frederick the Great was marching through the bloody campaigns of the 7 Years' War, surrounded by enemies and contemplating suicide, he carried a copy of Marcus Aurelius in his saddlebag, using the Stoics' words to steady his resolve. When Thomas Jefferson sat in his study at Monticello, drafting the philosophical foundations of a new republic, the Meditations lay open on his desk beside the works of John Locke and Epictetus. Even in the modern age, in worlds that Marcus could never have imagined, his voice remained entirely relevant. When Admiral James Stockdale was shot down over Vietnam and spent 7 brutal years being tortured in the Hanoi Hilton prison camp, he survived by repeating the principles of Stoicism he had learned from Marcus and Epictetus, using his mind as an unshakable fortress that his captors could not breach. When Nelson Mandela sat in the damp, claustrophobic isolation of his cell on Robben Island, fighting against a system that seemed designed to crush his humanity, a translated copy of Marcus Aurelius was one of the few books he kept close, drawing from it the quiet, patient resilience necessary to endure decades of silence without losing his soul to bitterness. Why does this voice endure? Why does a 21st century reader, sitting in a world of silicon chips, global networks, and space travel, find comfort in the private diary of a 2nd century Roman emperor? The answer lies in the absolute lack of pretense in Marcus's words. He is not lecturing you from a pedestal. He is not a religious prophet claiming divine revelation, nor is he an academic building an abstract system of thought to win an intellectual argument. He is a man who is actively suffering, a man who is tired, a man who is surrounded by people he cannot trust and responsibilities he cannot escape, talking to himself in the mirror at midnight. He is wrestling with the exact same existential anxieties that haunt every human being who has ever lived: the fear of death, the pain of betrayal, the exhaustion of daily effort, the pointlessness of human vanity, and the agonizing difficulty of doing the right thing when the world around you is falling apart. When Marcus writes, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts," he is not offering a cheap piece of self-help advice. He is giving you the formula he used to keep himself from going mad while managing a global pandemic and a multi-front barbarian invasion. When he writes, "Look within. Within is the fountain of good, and it will ever bubble up, if thou wilt ever dig." He is speaking as a man who dug through layers of imperial luxury and political corruption to find a small, clean spring of personal integrity that could not be polluted by outside events. He represents the ultimate integration of philosophy and action. History is full of thinkers who wrote beautifully about virtue while living lives of comfortable cowardice, and it is full of rulers who wielded immense power with a cruel, unthinking brutality. Marcus Aurelius remains one of the few individuals who held absolute, unchecked power over the known world and used that power not to enrich himself, but to discipline his own character. He proved that it was possible to be the master of the earth without becoming a slave to one's own desires. The white moon moves across the sky over the ruins of Rome, its light striking the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius that stands on the Capitoline Hill. This statue is itself a miracle of survival. In the Middle Ages, almost every bronze statue from the Roman era was pulled down and melted into building materials or weapons, because the Christian popes viewed them as pagan idols. But this specific statue was spared because the medieval citizens mistakenly believed it was an image of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. So Marcus survived on his bronze horse, his right hand stretched out over the city in a gesture of peace and clemency, while the world changed completely beneath his mount's hooves. He survived because his character was so profoundly human that even the mistakes of history worked to preserve his image. He sits up there in the dark, watching the modern world rush past his pedestal in a blur of lights, noise, and frantic, anxious speed. The empire he died for is gone, the gods he sacrificed to are forgotten, the language he wrote his diary in is dead. But the internal walls he built within his own soul remain completely intact. He is still standing guard, a quiet, reassuring presence at the edge of our own collective consciousness, whispering to us across 2 millennia that the storm outside does not matter, that the night will eventually pass, and that the only thing required of us is to remain human, to remain just, and to find our own stillness within the vast, changing currents of the universe. You are resting now, far from the frozen mud of the northern borders, far from the heavy gold of the Roman triumphs, and far from the relentless, demanding noise of human history. The long, exhausting march of the centuries has slowed to a crawl, and the weight that has been pressing down against your chest for the last hour is beginning to lift, dissolving into the cool, dark stillness of the room around you. The dying candle on Marcus Aurelius's desk has finally burned through its last drop of tallow. The flame gives one final, bright leap, casting a brief, magnificent glow across the empty chair and the closed papyrus journal, before it quietly goes out, leaving the room in a state of absolute, velvet darkness. The silence that fills the space now is no longer terrifying or cold. It is the vast, welcoming silence of the universe itself, the same great, rational cosmos that Marcus trusted with his entire life. The rain outside the villa window has stopped, the dark clouds have parted, and the deep black of the night sky is now filled with 1 million distant, silent stars, burning with a clean, eternal light that cares nothing for the small, temporary anxieties of emperors or empires. You can feel the profound, liberating relief of an ending. The emperor has laid down his pen. He has taken off the iron breastplate, stripped away the heavy, blood-stained purple robe, and walked out of the war tent for the very last time. His work is done. The border forts he built will eventually fall, the laws he wrote will be forgotten, and the son he tried so hard to guide will choose his own destructive path, but none of that can touch him now. He has crossed the river. He has entered into the great, quiet harbor where there are no more battlefields, no more casualty lists, and no more betrayals. He reminds you, through the echoes of his written words, that death is not a tragedy to be feared, but a natural, beautiful closing of a circle. It is the simple dismantling of an instrument that has played its tune, the returning of a lone to the vast estate of nature. You have boarded the ship, he whispers to you from across the dark water of time. You have set sail, you have made the voyage. Now, step ashore. If it is to another life, the gods are there too. If it is into a state of no sensation, you will finally be free from pain, free from pleasure, and free from being a slave to this vessel of clay. The tension that has held your body tight throughout his darkest night begins to soften, flowing out of your muscles like water sinking into dry sand. You realize that your own life, with all its chaotic demands, its daily stresses, and its uncertain futures, is part of the exact same design. The same logos that guided the Philosopher King through the horrors of the Antonine Plague is moving through your own life right now, balancing the cosmos with an immense, unyielding wisdom. You do not need to control the storm outside your window, you only need to control the stillness within your own mind. The stars above the Danube continue their slow, ancient dance, turning the great wheel of the sky without a sound. They have watched the rise and fall of Rome, the birth and death of civilizations, and the passing of countless generations of human beings who lay awake at midnight, wondering if they were strong enough to face the morning. And to every single one of them, the dark has offered the same gentle medicine, the gift of sleep. You let your eyes close completely now, letting the image of the old, silver-bearded emperor fade away into the shadows of your memory. He is no longer a historical figure to be studied, but an old friend who sat with you in the dark, shared his deepest sorrows, and showed you how to stand upright against the world before showing you how to rest. The air in your room is cool, deep, and perfectly safe. The demands of the next day are hours away, completely powerless in this quiet space before dawn. You breathe in the stillness, letting the rhythm of your heart slow down until it matches the vast, steady heartbeat of the universe around you. You have done your duty for the day. You have fought your battles. You have carried your weight. And now, like the last great ruler of the ancient world, you are permitted to let go of the reins, to surrender your consciousness to the dark, and to step quietly, gracefully, into the final, unbroken slumber.